Sylvia Ramos today will be presenting a lecture on women and the suffragette movement. Welcome.
Thank you, Henrietta. I want to say that my research was supported by a history scholars grant from the Historical Society of New Mexico and the Office of the State Historian. I want to thank the Society and its president, Henrietta Martinez Christmas, for inviting me to share my findings with you on this video. There is no opportunity here for a question and answer period, so I have included my email address on the opening slide. Please email me with any questions or comments, as well as if you have any information on suffrage or suffragists in New Mexico, I'd love to hear it. My research continues. Thank you very much. The suffrage movement in New Mexico is extensive. My intention today is just to give you a few stories of New Mexico suffragists because they highlight how deep, rich, and complex the movement was. The women you'll meet are a diverse group of women born between 1852 and 1894. I will present them chronologically by age. Some, like Adelina or Terra Warren, are already known to you. She has been featured in many newspaper articles over the years, and as you may have read in the paper, she is one of the first 5 women in the United States whose image will be on the backside of a quarter. All of these women were college-educated community leaders and women of action with strongly held beliefs and biases. They were homemakers and club women. 10 of the 12 were also mothers, and there were many other hats: teacher, businesswoman, writer, politician, physician, homesteader, musician, folklorist, historian, and rancher. As we know, men were the only ones who could vote. Women relied on them to carry their voices into legislative chambers. Without their support, the ballot could not have been won. Many men in New Mexico took part in that effort. Among them are 4 whose work was invaluable, especially towards the end of the road. Solomon Luna was the most powerful Republican leader in the Territorial Constitutional Convention in 1910. He was the uncle of suffragists Adelina Terra Warren and Aurora Lucio. He supported women voting in school board elections and worked to see it added to the new state constitution in 1912. Washington Lindsay was New Mexico's 3rd governor. He espoused progressive policies and worked with his wife Diane to convince legislators to vote for unrestricted women's suffrage. Andreas Jones, here in this corner, replaced Senator Catron in the United States Senate and became the chair of the Senate Select Committee on Women's Suffrage. He worked to get the amendment passed and sent to the states for ratification. By the time the 19th Amendment, also called the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, went to the states, referenda across the country showed support for women's suffrage by 3/4 of the states. Octaviano Larrazolo was the 4th governor of New Mexico and the first naturalized citizen of the United States to become a United States senator. He supported the vote for women and in January 1920 called for a special session of the New Mexico legislature to ratify the amendment and amend the New Mexico state constitution to include women's suffrage. Both tasks were accomplished in that session. The movement in New Mexico dates from 1874, when it was first introduced in the New Mexico legislature, to 1921, when the New Mexico Constitution was amended to allow women to vote and run for office in all New Mexico elections, not just school board elections. It took 46 years for women to convince most of the population, and perhaps more importantly, legislators, that they were entitled to the vote. Hundreds of women took part in activities that led to that victory. Many worked through one of the various women's clubs dedicated to improving the health and well-being of communities, promoting temperance and prohibition, or obtaining suffrage. I have found the names of over 100 women who belong to New Mexico suffrage-based organizations. I am sure there are many more who worked for the vote and were not members of any groups. Sadly, most of their names and stories are not known. They didn't write, perhaps did not talk about their work. I know the names of 7 Las Vegas suffragists, but I am not sure if any of them are in this car here, going, I would assume, to a parade. Perhaps they were even going to the delegation in 1915 to Santa Fe. If you know any of these women's names, I'd love to hear them. Much of the work of mobilizing and training women to work for suffrage and educating the public about its benefits was done by women's clubs. By 1911, there were 15 clubs scattered around New Mexico. Among them were the Clovis Women's Club, the Portales Women's Club, the Las Cruces Wednesday Club, the Santa Fe Literary Club, the Artesia Women's Club, and many more. For the most part, early records of club activities are not available. Unlike national suffragists who wrote the 6 volumes of the history of women's suffrage almost as it unfolded, these women may not have realized the importance of documenting their work for history books. Some clubs, like the Silver City Women's Club, get careful handwritten minutes. Others may not have. However, even when they did, finding out if someone still has those records and where they are stored is difficult. You can see from the notes some of the topics they addressed. They comprised what are usually termed maternalistic politics or social housekeeping. They're given that term because they address areas that were deemed important to women and children. Of course, many of the community improvements they brought about also benefit men. As around the nation, the vast majority of membership of these clubs in New Mexico was Euro-American and urban women. That was at a time when the state's population was 360,350 people. 83% lived in rural areas, and almost half were Spanish speaking or non-English speaking. Native Americans were 6%, and African Americans and Asians comprised only 1% each or below of the population. Of the women, 56% were Nuevo Mexicanas. A note about suffragettes and suffragists. Suffragette refers to women in England who were given that term originally in a derogatory fashion, but then adopted it. In the United States, men and women who work for suffrage are called suffragists. Suffragists were subjected to torrents of ridicule over many years. Nevertheless, they worked year after year to integrate themselves in the life of their communities. I think this tiny video I'm going to show you of the Industrial Day Parade in Albuquerque, October 1914, helps illustrate that. There were 6 divisions of marchers, so it was a long parade, and the suffragists were in the 3rd division. You can see there is this festive atmosphere. People are pouring out of the sidewalks, if there were sidewalks at that time. And there are a lot of men in the crowd. And there are a few women. I can see some women's hats in the crowd also. But what I want you to focus on are the marchers here. I'll show it again. Here is the YMCA of Albuquerque, and right behind them is the Women's Christian Temperance Union car full of women. And the Women's Christian Temperance Union nationally came out for suffrage in 1883 or thereabouts. Following them are men on bicycles with signs, and here is the Votes for Women float, and more of the Votes for Women cars. I can imagine the crowd cheering as everybody passed. As I noted already, there are many women whose work for suffrage throughout the country is still being uncovered. Some women didn't join organizations, but worked alongside them in less formal church and community groups. Many women of color were kept out of white women's clubs and out of the history books and records we have relied on for this history. That certainly was the case in New Mexico, where most of the suffragists I have found are Euro-American. A few are Spanish-American. I am still looking for specific evidence of African-American women in New Mexico who worked for the vote. So far, I have found 2 candidates, and I will present them in this talk. I have no Native American or Asian American suffragists yet. Ada McPherson Morley worked actively for suffrage in New Mexico longer than any other woman I have found. She was, in her own words, always and ever on the alert to gain my own liberty. Disenfranchisement is a disgrace. Mrs. Morley had a strong civic conscience, and even as a young woman, wrote letters to elected officials and politicians to castigate or commend them for their actions. Beginning in 1915, she wrote hundreds of letters to congressional delegates, legislators, and friends, urging support for women's suffrage. She was an early member of the Women's Christian Temperance Union and later served as president. In 1890, she proposed adding a suffrage department to the union. The proposal was met with enthusiasm, and she was asked to head the effort. Just before the convention of 1910 that met to write the Constitution for the new state, the group held what may be New Mexico's first public debate on women's suffrage. Although she was a rancher in the very rural town of Datil and raising 3 children on her own, she was an early and reliably active member of the Albuquerque Women's Club. In 1914, she joined Alice Paul's Congressional Union and worked to further its mission. Even as she was ailing in 1916, she participated in a large rally held in Magdalena to educate the public about suffrage and enroll members. On her death in 1917, the Evening Herald wrote, "Great woman gone. No more brainy idealist ever lived than this Tolstoy of the Datils. Albuquerque, the state, California, and Colorado have felt the impress of her trenchant pen that was always used for uplift and reform. The emancipation of women by enfranchisement was a life work with Mrs. Morley." Sadly, I don't yet have a photo of Dr. Alice Rice, who practiced in Las Vegas from 1895 well into the 1920s. I do have these 2 photos of her house and office. Her house and her office were the same. These are 2 views. And I like this one on the right because, as a newspaper noted, she had a large, bountiful garden, which she lent to a boys' club for summer gardening activities. I made this slide very full on purpose. All the suffragists I have studied were involved in many activities, personal, professional, and community. These women were smart, energetic, engaged in the world far and near, and committed to changing conditions, especially for women and children. Dr. Rice is no exception, as you may see on this slide. Her practice was in diseases of women and children. She was the first woman member of the New Mexico Medical Society. She was on the board of directors of the Ladies' Home of Las Vegas, which was actually a charitable organization that was founded to provide medical care to people who did not have any means to pay for it. So they had a hospital, a sanatorium, as well as a nursing kind of area. And their clientele was for the most part unable to pay. Maybe 15% of the patients who were treated there, and many were because they also performed surgery there, were able to pay the bill. She was also the physician and was a member of the Las Vegas Lodge of the Fraternal Brotherhood, which was an organization that was a mutual aid society and also a mutual insurance society. She was very active in the community, giving lectures on medical topics, of course, and a big one at that time, especially in New Mexico, was tuberculosis. She also was a founding member of the New Mexico Equal Suffrage Association in 1896. And at that meeting, she gave a talk that was entitled, "Does the Professional Woman Need the Ballot?" I am sure her answer, as well as probably most of the women there answers, was of course. She was president of the Las Vegas branch of the New Mexico Women's Christian Temperance Union, a member of the Greater Federation of Women's Clubs, and a member of the Sorosis Club of East Las Vegas. And it's interesting, this may be the first women's club in New Mexico, founded in 1887. They discussed all kinds of topics and presented lectures on philosophy, religion, literature, art, and they also raised funds for other endeavors, such as building a library in Las Vegas. She also was active in other realms. She was one of the witnesses when the Las Vegas Hospital incorporated, and I'm sure she practiced there early on. And also, when the People's Bank and Trust Company was founded in Las Vegas in 1912, she was one of the first shareholders. And all through this time, she was very, very active, as one can read in the newspaper, in all the activities of the Baptist Church and its Ladies Auxiliary. Just talking about her can make one tired. Diane Lindsay led most of the women's rights, suffrage, and service organizations in the state. Among them were the Temperance Union, the Federation of Women's Clubs, and the National American Women's Suffrage Association. In 1910, she lobbied members of the New Mexico Constitutional Convention to grant women school suffrage. She organized statewide women's clubs and suffrage group meetings that focused on women's agenda for change. In 1918, during World War I, she chaired the New Mexico's Women Civilian Committee on National Defense. While her husband, Washington Lindsay, was governor, she organized and hosted several strategy meetings before legislative sessions to bring together at the governor's mansion all of the major suffrage leaders in the state, even those who were at war with each other. Her work, alongside others for over 20 years, helped secure laws that benefited women and children. Among them, raising the age of protection for girls from 10 to 14 years, creation of juvenile courts, protection of women's community property in marriage, passage of prohibition and suffrage. They were very active. And this was recognized in January of 1920, just before the suffrage amendment passed in February of 1920. Dr. Margaret Cartwright is another example of how these suffragists were adept at what we now call multitasking. She was founder and first president of the Young Women's Christian Association of Albuquerque in 1910. She was president of the Temperance Union twice. She served as its superintendent of child welfare. She was also a member of Albuquerque Women's Club, Albuquerque Business and Professional Women's Club, and the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Dr. Cartwright practiced medicine, mainly obstetrics and gynecology, in Albuquerque for 34 years. She was Bernalillo County Chairman of the American Medical Association's Committee on Public Health and Education, and County Chairman of the Subcommittee on Affiliated Public Health Work. She did all this while raising 6 children, partly on her own, after the death of her husband in 1912. She was well known as one of the leading women physicians in the Southwest and as an active participant in all movements looking to the betterment of living conditions for women and children. Prior to moving to Albuquerque, she had been a Methodist missionary practicing medicine in Guanajuato, Mexico for 17 years, and she was fluent in Spanish. On November 24, 1920, presumably after casting her own first vote in a US presidential election, she accompanied Governor Lara Solo in a delegation to Mexico City for the inauguration of Mexico's president-elect, General Álvaro Obregón. Cora Armstrong Kellum dedicated her life to activism for women's rights. After the 19th Amendment was ratified, she joined Alice Paul in the now 98-year-long campaign to get the Equal Rights Amendment into the Constitution. We're still waiting. She was a member of the Albuquerque Women's Club, the Greater Federation of Women's Clubs, and a lifelong white ribboner. Her suffrage activities began in 1896 through the Territorial Association for Women's Suffrage. She joined the Congressional Union in 1914 and traveled by train, of course, several times to Washington, D.C. to lobby congressmen for suffrage prior to 1920 and for the ERA after that. As chairman of New Mexico's branch of the National Women's Party and New Mexico delegate from the Women's Committee of the Council on National Defense, she met with President and Mrs. Wilson at the White House in 1918. She said, "Mr. President, we, women of the West, are growing very restless indeed, waiting for the long-delayed passage of the federal suffrage amendment. Women in New Mexico and other states are eagerly awaiting action on this measure in the Senate. Won't you help us?" The president said, "I will do all I can," and he did. Maud McPhee Bloom grew up in a home where both parents were suffragists who had joined the New Mexico Territorial Association for Equal Suffrage in 1896. As she matured, she took part in women's clubs activities wherever she lived, including Las Cruces, Santa Fe, and Albuquerque. As the Albuquerque Women's Club historian, she wrote the 50th anniversary booklet in 1953. The year of its founding, in 1903, the organization enrolled 84 members, 5 of whom, you can see here, had Hispanic surnames. The sometimes humorous and detailed booklet gives insight into 50 years of women activism in Albuquerque and New Mexico. Though the club was begun for the betterment of women morally and intellectually, it eventually morphed into a political organization that activated and worked for community improvement and women's rights. This page shows Maud McPhee Bloom's annotations, in her own handwriting, of course, about the Las Cruces Women's Improvement Association founded in 1894. She said, "The first meeting was in my home at Las Cruces, and they bought a hearse for Las Cruces that first year." She was a member of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, the more moderate group working for the vote. As part of the suffrage league that brought together moderate and militant factions, she met at the governor's mansion in 1918 to discuss various aspects of suffrage and strategize on how best to approach legislators during the upcoming session. She is among several New Mexico women who are recognized by name in the 6th volume of the History of Women's Suffrage for their work to win the vote for women. Adelino Terra Warren was born into two well-to-do, well-connected, politically influential New Mexico families. They sparked her interest in politics and community service. She attended college at a time when most women didn't even finish high school. She lived in New York City from 1912 to 1914 while keeping house for her brother, who was at Columbia University. She volunteered at a settlement house there and provided direct services to poor and working families. She also worked to reshape public policy. Settlement houses, as you may know, also advocated strongly for women's suffrage. Her work for suffrage in New Mexico began alongside her uncle Solomon Luna in 1910 at that convention where women got only the franchise for the school board. When the Congressional Union came to New Mexico in 1914, she joined and was one of only 6 Hispanic women registered as members. She was fully bilingual and worked to educate the public about how women casting their own votes would benefit families and communities. Through her leadership in both the Spanish American and Euro American communities, she rose to be chair of the New Mexico branch of the National Woman's Party in 1917. That was the same year she was appointed school superintendent in Santa Fe. For years, she deftly worked with congressional members in Washington, D.C., and with the New Mexico legislature to rally and steady their support for women's vote. During the final day of the New Mexico legislature's special session, February 18, 1920, she stayed with the Republican caucus, the first woman to be allowed to do so in that chamber, and overcame forces of resistance from patriarchal clergy and politicians who were not ready to accept women as equals in the voting booth. The women won. Isabella Selmes Monroe Ferguson Greenway King, that is her full name because she had 3 separate marriages due to husband's death. Isabella Selmes Ferguson's early life was spent among socialites and the families of both Theodore and Franklin Roosevelt in New York. In 1910, she moved to Silver City with her husband, who had tuberculosis. He was searching for a cure. They moved also their 3 children, her mother, and her African-American childhood nanny. There, they initially lived in tents in the sanatorium compound and later homesteaded in the Burro Mountains. Periodically, they were visited in their quite rustic abodes by both Theodore Roosevelt and Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt and their children. Of Isabella, it was said she was a peculiar blend of Eastern establishment aristocracy and frontierswoman. She was an independent woman and an activist who in 1934, after her husband here died and she moved to Arizona, became the first woman representative in the Arizona's first woman representative in the United States Congress. In 1912, she canvassed in Silver City for Teddy Roosevelt's Bull Moose Party that advocating for women's suffrage in its platform. That was her first foray into politics. She was a member of the Silver City Women's Club, which endorsed suffrage in 1914, and she served on the Grant County Board of Education. In 1918, she was asked to head the Women's Land Army, part of the Women's Council of the Committee on National Defense. Her task was to bring in the crops planted by men who had gone to war. 500 farmerettes joined her. Conditions were harsh, turn hours in the fields with over 100-degree weather, bedding down at day's end on alfalfa or pine boughs. And that was during the influenza pandemic in 1918. In fact, Isabella helped nurse some of her workers until they were able to be taken to a hospital. Nevertheless, the women smiled and got the job done. Service during the war helped women show they were capable of tackling men's work while doing their own work and of functioning in the world of politics. It showed women as able organizers and flexible managers. Of course, they could handle the vote. Soledad Chacon was born into a well-established, influential New Mexico Hispanic family. She received a degree in accounting from the Albuquerque Business College, married and had 2 children. She was a member of several women's clubs, including the Albuquerque Women's Club. She was active in church and community service and worked alongside Terra Warren during the fight for women's suffrage. Once women won the vote, both political parties in New Mexico saw that having women on their tickets would benefit them. After all, women had worked long for suffrage and came out to cast votes in 1920 in big numbers. Soledad Chacon was one of the women they asked to run in 1922. She agreed and won both the nomination and the election. Thus, she became the first woman Secretary of State in New Mexico and the first Hispanic woman in the nation to win a statewide elected office. She served 2 terms, winning re-election handily. She was praised for her work by historian Charles Cohen, who wrote, "It is generally understood that the affairs of the office were never in better order than under Mrs. Chacon's administration." Perhaps her degree in accounting business also helped. In 1924, she became acting governor of New Mexico when Governor Hinkle was out of the state. The Lieutenant Governor Baca had died in office, and Chacon was next in line to preside. For 2 weeks, she fulfilled all the responsibilities of the office, even traveling in the state to settle disputes. She was, in effect, New Mexico's first Hispanic woman governor and the nation's first woman governor elected in her own right. Of this event, she said, "The hand of destiny had provided her that opportunity." I believe instead that it was the many hands women put to the plow to work for suffrage that did it. In 1934, she was elected to the New Mexico House of Representatives and was in her 2nd year in office when she died of peritonitis. Her daughter, Lena Ward, said her mother enjoyed her service in state government. She had been career-minded when she completed her education, she said, and felt her dreams were being fulfilled. Aurora Lucio presents a case in point about women's work for suffrage being disregarded. A 4-page article about her, published in 1964 in a Santa Fe magazine, said nothing about her public speaking skills. Yet in 1911, as a 17-year-old, she gave an impassioned speech urging the continued teaching of Spanish in public schools. That speech was celebrated throughout the Southwest. Worse, the article said nothing about her work to secure women's suffrage in New Mexico. That work began when the Congressional Union came to the state in 1914. She was 19 years old and already a celebrated bilingual orator and teacher in Tucumcari. Like Terra Warren, her cousin, she was politically well connected. Her father, Antonio Lucero, was New Mexico's first Secretary of State. She joined the Congressional Union and worked with Terra Warren to reach the Spanish-speaking population. They designed and distributed Spanish language promotional flyers. Her speech at a large rally, El Porvenir de los Niños, the future of children, stressed the health and well-being of children as reasons for women to have the ballot. The large Spanish-American audience responded favorably, and many joined the campaign. There are 2 African-American women in New Mexico who I believe were suffragists. Mary McIntosh Slaughter moved to New Mexico in 1881 as a bride. Her husband, William, was a self-made businessman. While living in Albuquerque, he was one of the organizers of the New Mexico Colored Religious Society and the Colored Methodist Mission in 1882. From that mission originated the Grand Chapel African Methodist Episcopal Church, the first Black church in New Mexico. It is still active in Albuquerque. The family was considered prosperous and affluent, and among Santa Fe's pioneer citizens, having settled in the city in 1883. In fact, their daughter's wedding, attended by Black and white citizens, received extensive covering on the front page of the Santa Fe, New Mexican newspaper in 1903. Mary McIntosh graduated from Fisk University in Tennessee and worked as a teacher prior to her marriage. She and William had 8 children. Her obituary states that her teachers had predicted a career for her as a writer, but she chose the career of rearing a family. The book, Bridges, New Mexico Black Women 1900 to 1950, states that she worked on the Santa Fe Women's Board of Trade and Library Association, established in 1892. The board was a women's club whose members were Euro-American with a sprinkling of Hispanic women. Their goals were betterment of the city parks and cemetery and establishment of a library. And they also worked for suffrage. I have not yet ascertained what Mary Slaughter's role was in the organization. What it means that she worked on it is not clear to me. I do have a copy of a commentary in the Santa Fe Reporter in 1984 entitled, "If Color Had Not Set Their Destiny." The author states, if Mary Slaughter had been white, more than likely her name would be on the bronze plaque in the foyer of the Santa Fe Public Library, listed with the elite group of women who founded the Women's Board of Trade and Library Association in 1892. She was educated, a hard worker, wanted the betterment of her community, and had a prosperous husband, all general criteria for membership. But at that time in America, she continues, skin color was destiny. I also have a voter list for the 1926 general election in Santa Fe County. Both Mary and her husband, William, or Willie, as it states here, are listed. I think that qualifies her as a suffragist. Lula Black was born in Kentucky and was an educator and high school principal in San Francisco before moving to Albuquerque. In 1914, she organized the Home Circle Club with 8 other matrons in the community. It was for intellectual, social, and moral uplift. They held meetings in her home. Sadly, I had not yet found records about their specific activities those early years. According to Rita Powdrell, the club's current president, it wasn't until 1925 that they began to keep more historical minutes. However, from the beginning, they focused mainly on education, childcare, and professional advancement. They also addressed lynchings and segregation, and were most likely involved in suffrage activities, especially since the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs had endorsed suffrage in 1912, and the Circle was originally part of their network. Although they worked independently, the club sometimes formed friendly alliances with Anglo clubs to work on specific issues. The Home Circle is still active in Albuquerque and continues to provide scholarships to college students. Mrs. Black was an accomplished musician and a choir director and Sunday school supervisor at the Grand Chapel AME Church. She and her daughter Yola taught private vocal and piano lessons. After being told that she and 2 other Black students could not attend graduation at the Albuquerque High School, Yola and the 2 other girls enrolled and graduated from a University of New Mexico program for high school students. She received what may have been the first music scholarship from the UNM School of Music. Subsequently, she married Theodore Brinson, a post office employee and violinist. Mr. Brinson was a vocal proponent for the rights of Afro-American citizens. In a letter to the editor of the Albuquerque Journal in 1917, he wrote in defense of a bill that would make it a crime for the keeper of any hotel, restaurant, saloon, or place of amusement to discriminate against any person on account of race or nationality. The bill, he said, was misconstrued as a social equality bill, but he stated it was a civil rights bill. Social equality plays no part in its construction, but only looms up as a scarecrow ingeniously devised to deny the Negro his constitutional rights. Lula Black and her family were activists for equal rights and justice. They had connections to the wide African-American community in New Mexico, including the slaughters in Santa Fe. I believe they worked for suffrage. In 1915, there was a deputation in Santa Fe of 150 suffragists to ask Senator Thomas Catron to support women's suffrage. This photo shows some of the women and Senator Catron. I believe this is Ella St. Clair. This is Julia Brown Asplund. I think this is Aurora Lucio, and this may have been Mrs. Cleofas Romero. The women, as I said, came to ask the senator to support suffrage in the Senate. Aurora Lucero was the one who spoke first. She said, "I speak for the Spanish American women who want the best possible laws when their home life is the question at issue." Altogether, 4 women spoke that day, but the senator was not moved. He did not believe women should have the vote and had opposed it in the Senate, even though he was the chair of the Special Senate Committee on Women's Suffrage. The very next year, he was defeated in his quest for another term by Andreas Jones. More likely, or most likely, women had had enough of his patriarchal attitude and the patriarchy in general, and were able to move their male relatives and friends to cast the vote that cast Senator Catron out and set the stage for women's suffrage in New Mexico and around the country to win the day. Before I end, I want to note that many citizens have been and are still being kept out of the voting booth, despite constitutional amendments and laws to protect voting rights. We know that is going on today, as much in some ways as it went on back then. So although we celebrate women winning the vote in 1920, the march for full voting rights for all citizens in this country continues. And I hope you will all join that march.